One of the major competencies of leadership is managing stakeholder relationships. We tend to talk about leading teams as primarily an inward-facing activity, developing people and managing the group dynamics among them. However, it is important not to lose sight of the fact that a major responsibility of the team leader is to manage the relationship between the team and various different stakeholders, leading the team by serving as its representative. A stakeholder is any party with a particular interest in the team or organization, either affecting or being affected by that group's activities. Traditionally, only owners and shareholders were seen as important stakeholders, not least because the organization has an obligation to prioritize their needs. However, stakeholder theory argues that numerous other parties also hold a stake in the organization. It identifies a broader range of organizational influences, including resource, market, and socio-political demands. Depending on the nature of the organization, this broader view may encompass a range of individual stakeholder groups, including workers, customers, suppliers, unions, professional groups, governments, and the communities where the organization is based. Some argue that even the natural environment is a relevant stakeholder. Friedman and Miles also distinguish between different types of stakeholders, categorizing them in terms of the compatibility of stakeholder interests with the organization's interests, and whether a relationship with them is necessary or contingent, lacking in inherent interconnectedness. Classifying stakeholders in this way can help determine how leaders should engage them. For example, the interests of a government regulator is likely not to be fully compatible with the organization's, but they are nonetheless a necessary stakeholder to consider. Given this classification, a compromise must be struck with a stakeholder in order to address their concerns. This often involves a negotiated agreement over resources. To facilitate this, explicit long-term contracts can be developed to help manage this particular stakeholder relationship. However, there are often multiple stakeholders, sometimes with competing interests. Leaders play a key role in prioritizing the importance of the various stakeholder influences. As group representatives, they are at the hub of these demands. They are responsible for determining which stakeholders are granted more influence and trying to reconcile the incongruities between them. Essentially, leaders determine which stakeholders get a say in the organization. Mitchell and his colleagues argue that managers identify these various stakeholder groups as important to the organization when they embody at least one of three key attributes: power, legitimacy, and urgency. The interests of those stakeholders that show all three attributes are given the clearest and most immediate attention. A leader's role, however, goes well beyond simply recognizing or categorizing stakeholders and their needs. They must proactively develop these relationships and consult key stakeholders in order to better understand their interests and promote the activities of the organization or team. We typically refer to this engagement with external stakeholders as boundary spanning, actions a focal team undertakes to reach out into its environment to obtain important resources and support. Boundary spanning can include various roles or activities. For example, Ancona and Caldwell observed product development teams engaging in three types of boundary spanning activities. Ambassador activities typically involve upward boundary spanning, with the goals of protecting the team from outside pressures and lobbying for external support for the team. Task coordinator activities typically involve horizontal boundary spanning between different functional groups in the organization. The goal here is to share information and coordinate team activities with outsiders. Scout activities typically involve boundary spanning across competitors or the broader market, with the goal of collecting information, scanning the environment for information that can be adopted. Interestingly, research suggests that while ambassador and task coordinator boundary spanning are associated with greater team effectiveness, Scout-style boundary spanning predicts lower team effectiveness. Another practical way to organize your thinking around boundary spanning is to consider the distinction between inquiry, seeking information and feedback, versus advocacy, promoting the team and its views. By themselves, both have a role to play for teams. Boundary spanning for inquiry is like interviewing or consulting stakeholders, providing information that the team needs for good decisions and problem solving. Boundary spanning for advocacy is more about selling stakeholders on the direction of the team, promoting acceptance of the team outcome. However, they are also not mutually exclusive, and leaders can shift the balance of inquiry and advocacy to suit the needs of the team. Balanced inquiry and advocacy together offers co-development, a mutual learning process. But this can also be time-consuming, particularly when dealing with more than one stakeholder group. Absence of both advocacy and inquiry is a lack of explicit stakeholder consultation. In this case, leaders are not proactive about boundary spanning, but may nonetheless be observing stakeholders. Faraj and Jan take this a step further. As discussed, boundary spanning is about reaching outside the team to obtain resources and support. Boundary buffering, on the other hand, is about protecting the team from exposure to environmental influences. Finally, boundary reinforcement is about defining the team boundaries in order to sharpen team identity. They propose that all three of these boundary management functions support positive internal team dynamics and higher team performance. Following from this broader scope of boundary work, a critical leadership role is to manage the level of influence that these external stakeholders have on the team. In fact, leaders can play with the boundary between the team and its stakeholders in order to strategically shape a particular team dynamic. We can illustrate this with the example of a product development team. Giving voice to the views of stakeholders, in this particular case customers, is critical. Quality product development decisions can only be made by considering the experience of the customer. To encourage this, leaders can give specific stakeholders airtime, or have team members engage with them during key phases of the project. However, if those stakeholders are given too much influence, it may hamper the team's creativity and efficiency. The team becomes reactive to stakeholder demands rather than focusing on the key objectives, hampering innovation. Moreover, impacts team efficiency. Thus, at key points in the process, leaders must protect the team from stakeholder demands, preventing these external influences from telling the team what to do. Autonomy is important for creative teams, giving them the freedom and flexibility to have wild ideas and take risks as they attempt to improve a product. So, there is an apparent trade-off here between team autonomy, which fosters things like creativity and efficiency, and team exposure to stakeholder influences, which fosters higher quality decisions and problem solving. However, good boundary management can get the best of both dynamics by boundary spanning or boundary buffering at precise points in the process. Using our product development example, boundary spanning is critical for understanding the problem in the first instance. But after information is gained, boundary buffering provides the team with the needed autonomy to develop novel solutions. And later, boundary spanning returns as stakeholders are again consulted for feedback on those solutions. However, this is not just about influences external to the organization. Boundary management also means that leaders serve as the conduit for communications between the team and higher-up organizational leadership, or other organizational groups. Dreskat and Wheeler identify 4 roles that leaders play when liaising between the team and the organization: relating, scouting, persuading, and empowering. When communicating with the team, leaders support team members and try to build trust. They also monitor, diagnose, and problem-solve challenging team member behavior. They represent the organization by influencing team goals and objectives, while at the same time delegating authority to the team. When communicating with the organization, leaders generate political awareness of their team. They also seek information from managers and specialists in the organization. And, when necessary, they represent the team in order to engage with the organization to seek resources and support. As a whole, these relationship-focused activities aid in generating team effectiveness. You can see why dealing with stakeholders is sometimes called boundary work. It's often complex and challenging to manage the variety of different stakeholder relationships. However, it is a critically important leadership function.